Have you got a decent picture of Judy now, Jonathan?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's good.
Oh, I'll sit up straight. Are you going to speak first?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday. I apologise for the April Fool joke about us meeting on the 1st of April. When Judy and I sat down to have a look, I think there's only 2 between now and the end of May. But anyhow, what I will do is I'll send out a note of the spring dates, because when we do the 1st and the 3rd, and we leave the 5th blank for anybody else to use, and then they bring in bank holidays and what have you. It's a damn nuisance, really. So I will send out a note in the next few days confirming our dates until June. And I'll hand over to our venerable teacher.
Yeah, let's be venerable.
No, I was trying to. No, all right, you take venerable and run with it. Over to you, Judy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody. Take no notice of Martin. Yes, welcome everybody. Hope you're well. Yes, he's saying distinguished now. That's a lot better. Just to explain something, a sort of disclaimer before we start. What I'm going to be talking about may appear very offensive to Catholics. I don't know how many of you are Roman Catholics, but this is a very tricky area in our history. When the church was under attack from various directions, things were going very badly wrong, not just in this country, but throughout Europe, really. And I've always had to sort of say this, and to classes that I used to teach when I was a teacher, you know, it's not me as a Protestant having a go at Catholics. It's the situation that existed in the 14th century. But when you study it all at once, all as a sort of one topic, it looks like a complete attack on the Catholic Church. And we shouldn't say the Catholic Church, we should just say the church, because there wasn't anything else to be. There weren't any other denominations. So we won't keep saying Catholic Church, because that does sound as though a Protestant is being critical of Catholic doctrines. So we're going to have a look at the problems, and then somebody called John Wycliffe, who the morning star of the Reformation, who pointed out many of these problems, but the mysterious thing is he was never condemned to death as a heretic.
Judy, can I correct you on one point? The Protestant Church is as much Catholic as the Roman Catholic Church is, and therefore it is the Roman Catholic Church you need to be talking about.
Only I'm not.
Well, indeed.
Only I'm not. No, I'm just going to say the church, just to make it clear. There weren't any. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. You're absolutely right. That we use the word Catholic in our prayers, and it means all embracing, all belonging to everybody. But we use it now to mean a denomination, don't we? We sort of say the Catholic Church down the road, and I mean St. Nicholas's Church in Boldmere. So, but you're absolutely right, Jonathan. Yes. But just to explain that the church had already divided in the 11th century, the Great Schism, the first one, between what we now call Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. The Christian Church had already split, divided, and that remains today. That the centre of the capital of the Eastern Orthodox Church, Istanbul, what was Constantinople, and the capital for Western Catholics is Rome. So having a look at the religious situation, which was very important to our ancestors, it was a current issue. First of all, the papacy, in crisis really during this period. First of all, to explain that the popes were landowners. They owned all the centre of Italy. They owned the papal states. They owned land. They had an army to defend their territory, and in many people's eyes, that reduced them in some way. It made them worldly. They had worldly concerns instead of being completely spiritual and confining themselves to spiritual matters. They spent an awful lot of their time defending their papal states and getting mixed up in all sorts of alliances. It made them seem less spiritual. They had land and territory, and they defended it very, very enthusiastically, let's say, throughout the Middle Ages. And Italy was in chaos anyway. And so Pope Clement V decided to move the Pope's headquarters to Avignon in France, away from all the chaos and the fighting and civil wars and all those awful things happening in Italy, which wasn't a united country, of course, until 1871. Italy was all separate little states, all fighting against each other. And it seemed like a good idea to move to Avignon, but in fact caused further chaos, because the popes then developed sophisticated methods of taxation. Everybody had to pay for the privilege of belonging to the church, and this caused massive resentment. And the English, our ancestors, particularly objected to paying their papal taxes to somebody that was living in France. France was our great enemy. So how could the Pope be impartial if he was living in France? This seemed outrageous to our ancestors. What had happened to the papacy? They were living in France. We called it the Babylonian captivity. There was something deeply troubling about the Pope, who gave orders to the clergy all over the Western world, Christendom, living in France instead of Rome. And then in 1378, there was what was called the Great Western Schism, where there were actually two popes, which made everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people very cynical. How can there be two popes? Who do we pay attention to? Because they were rivals. They were sort of cancelling each other's instructions. It was a ridiculous situation that the Catholic Church had got itself into, or the church had got itself into. Two popes at once, one in Rome and one in Avignon. And this lasted until 1417, and it did an enormous amount of damage to the status and prestige of the Pope, or popes. And accusations were then made, which had never been made before. The Pope was sacrosanct. He was the head. He was above all reigning monarchs. He had ultimate authority. He was second only to God. But now they were seen as ordinary human beings almost. They were too rich. They were too worldly. They were corrupt. Some of them were immoral. And they were too foreign. And that had not really been an issue before. It was all negative, all these complaints, and people. I mean, Martin and I have just been discussing or mentioning spitting image and what damage that did to some of our politicians and some of our leaders, to mock people, bringing them down to a level and even below the level certainly below the level they were at before. So they're no longer regarded with, they're not honoured or treated with respect. And it's a similar thing that in this period, because the popes, because there were two, and people found that very bewildering, it was suddenly all right to criticise the Pope. Suddenly all right. You didn't necessarily get arrested as a heretic because you'd said something critical about this situation, because a lot of people agreed that it was a ridiculous situation. It was therefore all right to comment on the individual popes. And Martin's found a lovely picture or the Avignon popes, Clement, John, Benedict, and other Clement, Innocent, Urban, Gregory. And noticing how splendidly they, several of them anyway, are dressed. That was another issue. How come there were two popes? Which one was the real one? The other one was a sort of a usurper. And the worldliness of why were they dressed in these fantastic robes when some people were having a very difficult time. They were hungry and living in awful cottages, and they suddenly all these things became an issue. And corruption, the fact that the popes took money, they openly took bribes to get a favourable answer to something. For example, when Henry VIII, that was much later, of course, when Henry VIII wanted his annulment, the annulment of his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he wrote a letter, and followed up by a letter from Wolsey and his bishops. He persuaded them all, you know, it was like a petition, and a lot of money. Everybody knew that the popes didn't do anything unless you sort of sent them a lot of money. That was just accepted. They didn't call it bribery. It was just that was what happened. They needed to have some financial inducement to grant what the king or queen or whoever it was, what they specifically wanted. I mean, in this case, it didn't work. The Pope didn't give Henry VIII the annulment he craved. But this idea came along that the popes were actually human beings, and they had very human faults. In fact, they had greater faults than ordinary people. So this was a new development, that it was all right to criticize the Pope. Not good for the popes, for the image of the papacy. And because of this, because the top person wasn't in a position to criticize others, it would have been the pot calling the kettle black, things began to deteriorate in the church hierarchy. The top clergy, the cardinals and the bishops, began to feel rather like the Pope, that they could do what they liked. They were sacrosanct because they had such high positions. Anyone that criticized them could be accused of being a heretic, totally out of line. You must not criticize the clergy. And sadly, a lot of very negative things started to happen. The top clergy became lazy. Mentioned already that bishops were supposed to go around on a 2-year circuit doing a kind of Ofsted inspection of all the religious houses, it was called, religious houses in their diocese. So from the big cathedrals to shrines, down to the smallest little parish church, or even the equivalent of a wayside chapel like we had in Sutton Coldfield. A little chapel dedicated to St. Blaise that was in the park. Bishops were supposed to check everything on this 2-year circuit. And that meant that if there was anything going on that shouldn't be going on, the bishop would find out and dish out some punishments. But because the popes were not giving very clear instructions, because they were hardly in a position to do so, they weren't maintaining very good discipline. Some of the top clergy decided that they weren't going to make much effort either, because they weren't going to be checked up on. And so they didn't do their checking up either. They didn't go on circuit. They lived in their lovely bishop's palace with servants, and they began to live like aristocrats and not do what they should have done. And corruption, it was known that they took bribes. Pluralism, get as many jobs in the church as you can because you got the income from them all. Pluralism became an absolute scandal. But who was going to check on that? Who was going to punish the people who were perpetrating this? Well, the Pope was hardly in a position. Well, the Pope's hardly in a position to do so.
What's pluralism?
Holding more than one job and getting the pay for both.
Both, thank you.
Like Wolsey had about 6 different jobs.
Yes.
And a secular job as well. He was the equivalent of the Prime Minister for Henry VIII, but he held a lot of, you know, he was the Archbishop of York, he was the Abbot of Wells, and oh, I can't remember the other one. Anyway, he had a lot of jobs all at the same time, took the income from all of them, and lived like a prince. That was the whole idea, that they were sort of outdoing each other in how worldly they could be, how many servants they got. Some of them even had started as security men, but then they built them up and they had a little army. Bishop Vesey had hundreds of people serving him, like a little mini army that went with him, you know, marched with him when he went out. He got all of this retinue, like a king or a prince, and he was one of the good guys. So worldliness, just living it up, living on fine food, eating, drinking fine wine, and having all these servants, and riding out on a fine horse instead of a humble donkey or a mule. The clergy were not supposed to have fine horses. All of a sudden, they were either having a fantastically beautiful mule like Wolsey, a really posh mule, but with silver a silver saddle and reins and everything, well, covered with silver. It was worldliness. That's the best way of describing it. And because they were neglecting their visitations, the local clergy thought, well, nobody ever comes to check up on us. It's just human nature. While the army is sort of constantly having parades and checking people's uniforms and seeing if their buttons are polished and so on. It's because if people are not checked up on, they tend to start getting lazy, excuse me, and not making much effort. And the longer that goes on, and the more relaxed everybody gets, the more things deteriorate. It's true of all large businesses and organizations. You've got to keep checking. Somebody has got to be in control. Otherwise, there is a lot of backsliding going on. Another problem, local clergy and parish priests were often very, very poor. It wasn't attracting new recruits. A bit like some occupations and some professions today. They're recruiting, but they can't get candidates because the job no longer seems attractive. Because of the Black Death, we've mentioned this already, complete crisis regarding local clergy, parish priests. Many of them had died. Thank you very much. Thank you. Many of them had died because of the Black Death, but it's a myth that they all stayed loyal and went on visiting people until they died, and a lot of priests actually legged it. They disappeared because they were afraid. But there was a desperate shortage when the Black Death temporarily died down. Lots of villages no longer had a parish priest, so there was a recruitment drive where they said, you don't have to have been to university, you don't even have to read and write. We will train you. You can learn the services off by heart like a parrot, and we will ordain you. So there are a lot of priests who really weren't properly educated. They were illiterate. They literally were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. But there was a panic, and so they were recruited in large numbers, and they were illiterate, they were ignorant, they couldn't instruct their flock because they didn't really understand the faith completely themselves. And they just went through the standard ritual services. They couldn't explain they really couldn't preach a sermon based on what they had just read in the Bible. There were exceptions. And one of them was Chaucer's poor priest, who was poor, but extremely conscientious and very godly. He's one of the exceptions. If you read Chaucer, he's got his knife into most of the other religious characters, well and truly, really got his knife into them. But the poor priest stands out as a genuinely good and holy man. So there was a great temptation to not be a parish priest, but be a chantry priest or a chaplain. If you're a chaplain, you were a priest that lived in somebody's posh house, and you lived in the house with them, so you had nice food and everything. You had your own room, and it said prayers as and when. Or a chantry priest meant that you chanted prayers for the dead, and that was seen as a doddle. That was something people aspired to, because that was easy, and you got backhanders to say more prayers than the regulation suggested, and you met important people, and you could get other promotions. It was something that, instead of being a parish priest, which was hard work, then you could be either a chantry priest or a chaplain. So a lot of the new recruits, if they could read and write, headed off in that direction. And once again, the local villagers, the villagers were neglected. Another problem was the clergy were allowed land called glebe land. That had always been the case, that the clergy were given land to live on, to support them. And many of them spent a lot of time on their farms, doing their farm work, and neglecting their duties as priests. Again, very tempting, because that was their livelihood. That was what they lived on. They weren't paid as such, although any chance to make money, they took it. Another very important development, particularly speeded up after the Black Death, was the belief in shrines, relics, and the value of going on pilgrimage. And a new development was the granting of indulgences, so that if you went to certain shrines, you would gain time of purgatory, which was something else which people believed in. Our ancestors believed that you probably wouldn't go straight to heaven or straight to hell when you died. You would go to a sort of an intermediate sort of holding area called purgatory, where you would be purged of your sins, hence the word purgatory. You were sinful, you had committed many, many sins, you would probably stay in purgatory for thousands of years. It was a sort of prison where you did time. But people could pray for you, and during your lifetime you could build up credit with God by going on pilgrimage and visiting certain shrines, and that would take time off purgatory. And this became more and more important to our ancestors, that they would travel greater distances to go to the more important shrines. The greatest ones were Rome, and of course the most important of all, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And it became a lucrative business. The pilgrimage routes crisscrossing Europe became very profitable, because pilgrims had to stay somewhere and they required transport. And so this became a secular kind of business, although it was actually spiritual in origin. It became secular. It was very difficult to travel all the way to Jerusalem, because you crossed various land borders, or you could go by sea, but you still had to go through various countries, and you had to pay heavy tolls to use their roads and their bridges. And when you came to a border, you had to pay the guards at the border to let you go through to the next country. There were brigands, there were people mugging you, or likely to mug you. It was very, very difficult to get to Jerusalem. It could take 2 years, a year there and a year back. Plus, you might catch horrible diseases as you got into the hotter areas well, out of Europe into the Mediterranean. You might catch something horrible. So that's why you got a lot of time off purgatory if you went to Jerusalem. So it was all right, your meter was ticking, you were committing sins, the meter was ticking, you were gaining more time in purgatory, but you could do various things to reduce your time in purgatory before you actually died. And people could pray for you and do things like going on pilgrimage for your soul after you died. So this became an obsession, although it's not scriptural. The important thing, it isn't in the Bible. And indulgences are not in the Bible. That if you, for example, paid to build a new church tower, if the old church tower, the Norman Tower or Saxon Tower in your local village was collapsing and you got enough money and you offered to pay for the rebuilding of the tower, then you could get, oh, maybe 500 years off purgatory, probably more. There was a kind of tariff that had been worked out. So our ancestors were sort of very much into this. If they lived in a small village, they couldn't afford to go to a big shrine and get lots of many years off purgatory. But if they did something like walked to Lichfield to the shrine of St. Chad, the Saxon saint, if they walked barefoot, they could get more time off purgatory. If they walked, if they went on a donkey, then they got less time because it was easy then. They weren't getting footsore. Barefoot, you got more kudos. So that's what our ancestors were thinking about it's a kind of a worldly way of thinking about religion. The other temptation, of course, was that the people, many of the shrines showed genuine relics, but there was a great temptation that if you were a cathedral or a church, you wanted to attract pilgrims, make money. So it's worldly again, it's commercial. You needed some relics. So it's very tempting to create some. And Chaucer's Pilgrims, one of Chaucer's Pilgrims actually explains how he did it. He used pig's bones and said they were the bones of saints' fingers, pig's bones. So there is corruption and deception, which are absolutely not non-Christian, coming into religion very much after the Black Death, creating shrines and offering, showing false relics. And our ancestors who couldn't read or write and were very gullible believed in them, and that's obviously the bad side of this. Apart from the fact that there was so much money involved, the number of pilgrims going to saint shrines actually went down. It's been discovered now through a lot of research. But veneration of Our Lady increased. They were called the Marian or Marian shrines. And we had a big Marian shrine, which attracted pilgrims from all over Europe. Walsingham in Norfolk, where there was a reproduction. Somebody, a Saxon lady had a vision. And in the vision, in the dream she had, she dreamt that she'd seen the home where Jesus had lived in Nazareth. The simple wooden furniture and everything. She said she'd had a vision and she'd seen it, and she asked permission to reproduce it at Walsingham, and it was called the Holy House, and it attracted pilgrims from all over this country and then from other parts of Europe. And then other relics were shown, like Our Lady's girdle, Our Lady's milk, and it became, and there was a holy well. And many miracles actually took place there. That cannot be disputed, that there were faith healings that took place, just as they took place at Canterbury. Because our other great shrine, of course, was Becket's Shrine in Canterbury. So people came from, say, the other side of Europe, making amazingly long journeys, because they believed in the efficacy, the value of the saints, of the relics, but also the whole pilgrimage experience was uplifting and spiritually enriching. And they didn't realize in many cases that they were being exploited. So it wasn't the pilgrims' fault. They'd been told that this was good for their soul, even if they could pray for people already dead and they were in purgatory. They could pray for their own souls. They could bring poorly people with them, or they could take some holy water back to put on the poorly person at home and pray that they would get better. And certainly in the big shrines, the cathedrals, where they got space, they had a room full of proofs that the prayers had worked, that the saint had interceded for the poorly person. So at Canterbury, certainly, there was a room full of crutches and stretchers and bandages and all sorts of medical aids that they got at the time that proved that somebody had prayed for a cure and they had been cured. So we mustn't be cynical about the pilgrimages, because people went in faith and their faith was rewarded. And that's one of the things that you could do when you went to the shrine, while you were waiting, because there were huge queues, while you were waiting, even to get into the cathedral, well, just after you got into the cathedral, they would show you this room to enhance your faith, to keep your faith, after you'd done the long, you'd be queued for ages, you're probably beginning to feel a bit fed up. So to keep your spirits up, you could go into this room and see all the proof that people have been cured. Because if you can read, there's a little label on everything with the name of the person who'd been cured and the date of their cure. So it's very efficient. So the sad thing is that once people realised you could make money out of shrines, the shrines had a heyday in terms of money. So in many of the, let's say a cathedral that had a relic, you paid to go in to look at the shrine from a distance. Then you could pay again to go right up to it and look at it closely. And then on certain days, or if certain people paid a huge amount of money, the actual relic would be available to actually see the relic itself, not just the container. Like a holy thorn, for example, a thorn from the crown of thorns, they would open the little cabinet, gold or silver cabinet that the holy thorn was kept in, take the holy thorn out, and if you paid even more money, on certain days, holy days, you're allowed to touch the thorn, but you had to pay each stage. So that's why churches and cathedrals particularly wanted as many relics as possible, so they'd got on this sort of huge, on constant flow of thousands of pilgrims. So this is all going the wrong way. It's commercializing faith, and it's introducing corruption, because not all the relics were genuine anyway. So it's exploiting people's innocence and trust. Pardoners particularly conning ignorant people using fake relics, and that was one of Chaucer's pilgrims, an evil pardoner. So if you can get hold of a modern translation of Chaucer and read what the pardoner was like in the prologue, you will not like the pardoner one little bit. He was a corrupt rogue. Walsingham had been reopened. It was totally demolished, of course, during the Reformation. The Holy Well was filled in, and Walsingham became, well, a derelict area. And then in 1926, an Anglican, a sort of Anglo-Catholic vicar, decided to bring Walsingham back, and they found the well, emptied took all the rubbish out of the well, and discovered it was still in working order. There's a spring underneath the Holy Well, and you can go to Walsingham now on pilgrimage. And the slipper chapel, where people took their shoes off, walked the last mile barefoot. Even Henry VIII did that, praying for a son. Henry VIII walked the last mile barefoot over some very rough ground. So yeah, your feet were sort of cut and bleeding by the time you reached the actual big shrine at Walsingham. But the slipper chapel is now the Roman Catholic shrine. And when we went years ago, we much preferred that to the High Anglican Walsingham shrine, which we didn't like very much. In fact, my husband walked out, he'd outside because there were so many people trying to convert him. So he disappeared. Kept saying, I hate it here. When are we going to have lunch? I do remember that. Now, with regard to all this kind of going wrong with the church, and yet our ancestors were probably more concerned about their souls than any generation had ever been because of Black Death, because they didn't know why the country was being punished. That's what they thought God was doing, that the country was being punished for not being sufficiently religious. So people, our ancestors, were very, very concerned about their souls in a way we can hardly imagine. It was incredible. I mean, they didn't go to school, so it was sort of the equivalent of education. That wasn't in their lives, and it was in ours, and still is if we've got children and grandchildren. But it's hard to explain how important religion observances were to our ancestors, but they were being corrupted, not through any fault of their own. And then there were people like Chaucer who were brave enough to sort of speak out. I mean, nothing ever happened to Chaucer because he was the court poet, and he's the first man to be buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. He actually started Poets' Corner. Well, he didn't because he was dead, but people who admired his poetry decided he ought to be buried in Westminster Abbey, and that started a whole idea of top poets being buried in Westminster Abbey near Chaucer. So he got away with criticism, because normally if you criticised the church or clergy, you were in big trouble. It was regarded as a form of heresy. You're criticising the people who knew better than you did. You're an ignorant peasant. How dare you raise your voice against the church hierarchy? They told you what to do. You did not raise your voice against them. And then we've got somebody called John Wycliffe, who got the title the Morning Star of the Reformation, which is a wonderful title. Born in Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, from a gentry background, certainly not a peasant. And he was lucky enough to have a very, very important sponsor, John of Gaunt, fourth son of Edward III and Queen Philippa. They had a huge family. John of Gaunt, the fourth son, which doesn't sound very important, 3 times the spare. But in fact, over time, he became very much more important. So a brilliant person to have sort of guarding your back. So when John Wycliffe started to speak out about all the errors in the church, the corruption, the different aspects of the church which were really non-Christian, nothing happened to him. If he hadn't had a very, very influential supporter, he would have disappeared as a heretic. He'd probably been hanged. Most people think heretics were burned. Well, they weren't burned until a special law was introduced in the reign of Henry V. Henry V is one of our good guys, like Edward III. Henry V's reign was much shorter, but he defeated the French. So anyone that defeated the French was sort of put up on a pedestal and revered, and we still, you know, over generations and hundreds of years, still revered as a great king. Well, one of the sort of not so great things that Henry V did, he was very bigoted, he's very narrow-minded when it came to religion, and actually quite cruel. And other countries had introduced laws whereby heretics could be burned. The full phrase is burned at the stake. The idea was to give them a taste of hell, but it was mainly meant to be for the onlookers. So the execution took place in public, and the idea was that it would be a deterrent. Watching somebody being burned to death, burned alive, was a deterrent, and it was also visually, to people who couldn't read and write, it's what hell was like. Hell was fire, and therefore being burned was showing you what fate awaited you if you continued to criticize the church. But we hadn't had that punishment. We hanged or whipped them or put them in the stocks. We didn't always put them to death. But in the reign of Henry V, he introduced this new law, and he got it through Parliament, that heretics should be burned. They shouldn't be allowed any other option because they were so evil. So John Wycliffe wasn't actually facing death by burning, but he was facing punishment, and certainly the ultimate was to be hanged. So he went to university. We only had 2 universities then, Oxford and Cambridge. He became Master of Balliol and had a temporary post as Warden of Canterbury College. Now, ironically, even John Wycliffe, who criticised the church in all manner of ways, even he was a hypocrite, because he was very much against pluralism and absenteeism, another problem, that if you have a lot of top church jobs, if you're bishop of more than one place, or you're abbot, as Wolsey was, abbot of a large monastery, you can't be everywhere at once, and there's no question you can't possibly cover all your jobs properly. If you are a pluralist, you've got too many things to concern yourself with. You tend to concentrate on one of those jobs and neglect the others. Cardinal Wolsey never went to York. He was the Archbishop of York. He never went to York following his consecration as Archbishop until the last years of his life, when he was disgraced and sent into exile in Yorkshire. He never went near the place. He appointed somebody else to do his work, but he got the money. Paid the other person a pittance. That's how it worked. So pluralism led to absenteeism. The boss was never around. Consequently, when the cat's away, the mice will play, which is what we were saying earlier. And John Wycliffe actually was a pluralist and an absentee. So he was actually criticising what people thought for what he was doing himself. He was a philosopher. He wasn't an open-air preacher. Some people thought he was. He was an evangelist, and he went out and about sort of preaching like the friars did. The other thing about him which is interesting, he never experienced conversion as Luther did, for example, and John Wesley. He never had a Damascus Road experience. He never had a moment when suddenly he felt enlightened, or he felt that his soul was no longer in danger, that he was saved. He was an intellectual. So he came to his belief system through reading the Bible, basically, and thinking about things. He didn't have one moment of amazing revelation or inspiration, but he was known for his great learning, completely an intellectual who wrote books and translated the Bible, and Martin's very helpfully put in translation for us, so you can see it's totally easy to, well, not totally easy to read, but it's totally readable. You can read, you can understand it. It's amazing how many words are totally familiar to us. There are 1 or 2 that are not, but you can work out what they actually mean. Because that was another development. English was taking over completely from French. One of the effects of the Black Death was that a lot of people who taught French died, and that gave English as a language, a big boost. So he then became, in 1374, Wycliffe became the rector of Lutterworth, and he remained there. That was his position. But he was an important character, and with a strong personality. And then in 1377, he began to write these famous pamphlets criticising the church, which was a brave thing to do, talking about corruption. The church was too rich. Why weren't they giving the money to the poor? Why were they hoarding the money? Why were they trying to make money? That was not Christian. That was against the teachings of Christ. And then he talked about authority, grace, and excommunication. And the Pope ordered his arrest. and nothing happened because he was sensible enough to have got this very powerful sponsor and protector, Prince John of Gaunt. His proper title was Duke of Lancaster. Don't forget the Gaunt bit. It meant he was born in Ghent, or however you say it. He wasn't born in this country. So John of Gaunt is a bit misleading. He was the Duke of Lancaster. He was incredible. He was very powerful in terms of territory. You know, he's the fourth son of the king. He was very rich and influential. So he protected Wycliffe over and over again. And Wycliffe was actually invited to speak to the House of Commons. The bishops were absolutely up in arms. I mean, this guy wasn't even a bishop. You know, what authority did he have? Well, he said he had the authority of Holy Scripture. So he was entitled, as it were, to speak out. He said it was his duty to speak out against what he saw was going wrong with the church that he loved so much. He was entitled to speak out. Very radical and amazing, really, because he was actually saying what Luther said 200 years later. And between 1380 and 1384, he worked on the first complete English translation of the Bible. Like Luther, he believed that people should have the right to read the Word of God in their own language. That if you could read, you should be able to read the Bible. Well, of course, that wasn't the teaching of the church at the time. The Bible was in Latin, and only certain people were allowed to read it because it was so holy and so sacred and so special that ordinary people must not be allowed to read it because they wouldn't understand it. And there were all sorts of arguments about why our humble ancestors should not have the Bible. That went on until Henry VIII changed his mind. He had been in agreement with this, and then for all sorts of political reasons, Henry VIII changed his mind and provided a Bible written in English in every parish church, and that's been the case ever since. That the Bible should be available, open, on a lectern, for anybody that can enter the church to go and read if they haven't got a Bible of their own. So Henry VIII completely did a complete U-turn in terms of the Bible. Before that, it was illegal to own a Bible in English. You could be arrested and you could be tried as a heretic for having a Bible in English. Quite incredible. So Wycliffe believed that everybody had the right, the God-given right, to have a Bible in a language they could understand. And when it did happen, of course, it had a great effect on literacy. A lot of people then decided that they would learn to read because they wanted to read the Bible. So 1182, somebody called Archbishop Courtney called a synod to condemn heretics. And the people who supported Wycliffe, because he had a large support group, got a nickname, Lollards. Because when they chanted, when they sang, people mocked them and said they sounded as though they were going like that. So their nickname was Lollard, because they sounded, that was to mock them, to make them sound stupid, and therefore don't take any notice of these stupid people. Wycliffe had a lot of support. He eventually retired to Lutterworth. He was forbidden to preach at the university, but he was protected again by his sponsor, the Duke of Lancaster. And in 1384, Wycliffe died. He was never officially declared a heretic, because he got royal support, and he was never excommunicated, which he should have been according to the rules at the time. He should have been excommunicated. He knew that. He totally lived on the edge. He expected to be put to death. It never happened, but he expected all the time that it would. And he expected that he would end his life as a martyr. Not because he wanted to be a martyr, but because he knew that that was the risk he was taking. He was brave enough to be speaking out on a series of very controversial issues. A very, very brave man, and sort of underrated, really, Everybody knows about Luther, but we don't know about our homegrown Luther. So I've written out some, so Martin's written a lovely piece of the Bible, and you can say it's totally readable. The spelling is weird, of course, but the spelling in English remained weird until the 18th century, because people spelled as they spoke. There was no rigid spelling rule or law in this country. People spelled how they felt on the day. You could spell your name in lots of different ways. Shakespeare spelt Shakespeare, I can't remember now if it's 15 different ways or 12 different ways. So it's a bit like a quiz question. Can you think of 12 different ways of spelling Shakespeare? So you can spell S-H-A-C-K, or you can leave the E off the end, or you can put no A, you do 2 E's and an E on the end, no E on the end. Leave the middle E out, Shakespeare, leave the S-H-A-K, no E, spear. Try it sometime when you've got nothing else to do. It's quite an interesting thing quite an interesting challenge. Can you think of, I think it is 12 different ways that Shakespeare spelt his surname? Well, nobody said go to the bottom of the class, William Shakespeare. You know, you're obviously special needs, you know, or you've got dyslexia, because there was no standardized spelling until Samuel Johnson produced his dictionary, and then that made it standard that there was a correct way of spelling and an incorrect way of spelling. So it was perfectly all right to spell any old how as long as people could read it. So it's phonetic, really. It just depends how you felt on the day. Or if you got a strong local accent, then your spelling would be accented. It would show that accent. So please read what Martin's written. I mean, it's actually not what Martin's written, what Wycliffe wrote that Martin's reproduced, because it's really interesting.
I was riding on a crest of a wave.
And I'm just going to read to you some of John Wycliffe's beliefs, remembering what the standard belief at the time was, that the only priests could hear confession. It was confessed regularly, but only to a priest. You couldn't communicate directly to God. A little bit like if you went to an office and you sort of said, I've got a complaint, I want to see the managing director now. Well, that wouldn't happen. Either the managing director wouldn't be available, or you certainly couldn't march into an office and demand to see the top person. You would have to have an appointment, and you'd have to go through a kind of a hierarchy. You probably wouldn't see the top person anyway, wouldn't be available. So the church taught that it was a very impertinent idea that you could talk directly to God or to Jesus. So you really ought to go through somebody who was in heaven, who would speak kind of on your behalf. So like if you did have a complaint and you went to an office, you'd sort of speak to somebody much lower rank than the managing director. And eventually you would speak to somebody in authority, but it wouldn't be the top person. And that was the belief that because, you know, we were humble sinners, we couldn't speak directly to God or to Jesus. We would have to go via a saint, and the saint would be our advocate. They would speak on our behalf. So that was challenged by Wycliffe. Another idea was that priests were very special, and therefore they wore special robes. He challenged that. He challenged the idea that people couldn't have the Bible in their own language. He challenged the very basis of the belief that transubstantiation, and I'm not going to go there because it is a very, very, very controversial subject. But I'm just going to read these. These are statements that he made. Holy Scripture is the highest authority for every believer, the standard of faith and the foundation for reform. Next one. Trust wholly in Christ, rely altogether on his sufferings. Faith in our Lord Jesus Christ is sufficient for salvation. You don't need to go on pilgrimage. You don't need to touch a holy relic. Third one, Englishmen learn Christ's law best in English. Moses heard God's law in his own tongue. So did Christ's apostles. Next one. Private confession was not ordered by Christ and was not used by the apostles. You see how controversial this is? The fifth one. It is plain to me that our prelates, in granting indulgences, do commonly blaspheme the wisdom of God. Pay your money and have your sins cancelled. Next one. The laity ought to understand the faith, and since the doctrines of our faith are in the scriptures, believers should have the scriptures in a language familiar to the people. That was the drum he kept banging over and over again. People should be allowed to have the scriptures in their own language. Seventh one, I shall not die, but live and again declare the evil deeds of the friars. How controversial was that? Friars were wandering preachers. They were evangelists. And new sects of friars were developing all over Europe, Dominicans, Franciscans, different kinds of friars going around preaching the word. It was known they were corrupt. It was known that they were not just worldly, but many of them had sexual relationships, which they weren't supposed to have. They were supposed to be celibate. The friar is another of Chaucer's baddies, the friar. But to openly criticise friars was to risk being arrested as a heretic. So, very blunt. Very blunt. The evil deeds of the friars. His supporters must have been absolutely wincing, thinking, good grief, what else is he going to say? Next one, I acknowledge that the sacrament of the altar is very God's body in form of bread, but it is in another manner God's body than it is in heaven. So that's the transubstantiation issue. 9, crown and cloth maketh no priest, nor emperor's bishop with his words, but power that Christ giveth, and by life have been priests known. There's a complicated way of saying dressing up in posh vestments doesn't make people holy. 10th, the gospel alone is sufficient to rule the lives of Christians everywhere, and additional rules made to govern men's conduct added nothing to the perfection already found in the gospel of Jesus Christ. In other words, let's keep it simple. The church has become too worldly, too corrupt, too complicated. Let's get back to basics. Let's get back to simple Christianity. And this was wildly radical. Next one, the high service to which a man may obtain on earth is to preach the law of God. And then finally, well, it isn't finally, he said lots more things than this, but I've just cherry-picked. I believe that in the end, truth will conquer. Wow. Remembering that he was risking his life in saying any of these things. And put all together, yeah, it's amazing that he died of a stroke. Well, 2 strokes. You know, he died, he died in his bed. An amazing character. And his supporters continued to preach his doctrine after he died, but low key, because they weren't as brave as he'd been, and they didn't have a royal protector. So understandably, they were feeling a little nervous. And then in the reign of Henry V, great grandson, when they brought in burning for heretics, people were very much more cautious about criticising the church. They knew there was a lot going wrong. There was a lot of corruption, a lot of things going wrong, but they became understandably very nervous about raising their voices and complaining and saying anything. People just went with the flow. So that sounds like a rant against it does rather sound like a rant against Roman Catholicism, but it isn't, because intelligent people in the church knew that there were things going wrong, but they didn't quite know what to do about it. It was something that was sort of developing very much as a result of the Black Death, which had decimated the population in the whole of Europe. It was a bit like people wandering in the wilderness. They didn't quite know what to do. They didn't know how they assumed they'd offended God in some way. And people did make huge donations to the poor, but they tended to more give money to a church so that people could see what they'd done. And that was the worldliness that many churches, if you go around churches in East Anglia, for example, absolutely lovely churches, many parts of the church being donated by a particular family or an individual, a wool merchant. He wanted what he'd done to be seen. And Wycliffe was arguing, and the people who followed Wycliffe, if you want to give money, you should do it so that nobody knows what you've done. Otherwise, it's cancelling out the good thing you've done. If you're doing it if you're showing off what you've done, it rather cancels out the benefit, the spiritual benefit you will receive, particularly if you've got your name on it. There are some churches in East Anglia where people have had their monograms incorporated in the stonework, which is, look at how generous I've been, which it rather cancels out the great thing that they've decided to do, giving money. And as Wycliffe and his supporters said, why don't you give it to the poor? Because that's Christ's teaching. Give to the poor. Don't do it to promote yourself or your family or your business, or you can't bribe God. So that was happening while Edward III was king, and he himself was very pious. He went on many pilgrimages, interestingly, not to Canterbury. Kings didn't seem to go to Canterbury because, of course, Becket had been opposed to the king, so they tended to avoid Canterbury, except on special occasions, in a particular Becket Saints' Day. But Edward III went on about 5 pilgrimages every year. That was sort of standard. And again, if we could do our family tree and carry it that far back, we'd probably find that our ancestors were pretty obsessed with going on pilgrimage, although they probably couldn't travel very far because of monetary limitations. But they would probably go to Lichfield, and they might even have gone barefoot. So that's worth thinking about, whether we would consider doing that journey with no shoes on. I don't think we would.
Judy, could I risk a question which might send you to Lally? We talk about people knowing things, and nowadays we're used to the 10 o'clock news, we're used to internet and all the rest of it. What were the mechanisms for the societies
getting to know things,
getting to know what was going on?
That's a very good question.
Is that a whole session on its own?
No, I mean, if you lived in a town, there were town criers,
right,
with loud voices that would announce things like the king has died, or we're at war with France, or like big news. And there were the heralds, of course, in London, royal heralds that had trumpets and made everybody stop doing what they were doing, and then they made announcements. But a lot of it's a good question, because a lot of knowledge depended on people who travelled a lot, like peddlers.
Oh.
The problem with peddlers was they did pick up a lot of information, but they tended to exaggerate it or get it wrong, get it a bit mixed up. And so that's when rumours started and legends developed. And, I heard it from this guy that came selling herbs in the village or whatever.
And he'd seen the miracle.
And many of them. And the other thing I just mention this, that if you couldn't afford, I mean, this was a form of corruption in a way. If you couldn't afford to go to Jerusalem, but you were very rich, afford the time to go to Jerusalem, but you were very rich, you got the money to go to Jerusalem, but you were a top merchant or industrialist, you'd got a business you were running, probably a wool business, you couldn't afford to give up the time 2 years to go to Jerusalem and back, or run the risk of being mugged on the way up. So what you did was you paid somebody to go on your behalf. And that's where the name Palmer came from. It's quite a common English surname, Palmer, Palmer. Palmer, it was a profession. A Palmer was a professional pilgrim. He would go elsewhere, but the true Palmers went on the long journey to Jerusalem for a specific client who paid for them, paid them anyway, paid them a salary, and paid for their journey and their accommodation. But to prove that they'd been, because it would have been quite tempting to take the money and then not actually go to Jerusalem and come back after 18 months or 2 years and say, I've been, give us the rest of the money you promised. To prove you'd been, you had to collect some palm that only grew in Israel, all that part of the world. You brought the palm back in your hat. That became the tradition. You brought the palm back, so you're advertising to everybody, because then on the return journey, you got all kinds of concessions because people thought you were holy because you'd been to the shrine at Jerusalem, the Holy Sepulchre, and other shrines that were there as well, the Holy Steps, all sorts of wonderful shrines in Jerusalem, and you'd been to the Holy Land, so you were holy. So you wore the palm in your hat, and the professional ones had got palm all the way around their hats. They got shriveled palm that had from pilgrimage they'd done 5 years before, and then some fresh palm that they just collected, and they got the nickname Palmers because they got palm in their hats, hence the nickname, the surname. But in a way, that is a form of corruption because they were praying on behalf of somebody else, and somebody else, there was money involved. So
The next Sunday's Palm
that
Sunday.
was, yes, next Sunday is Palm Sunday. So yes, it was something that rich people could do to avoid the incredible amount of time that they would have to dedicate to this, and also the risks that they didn't feel they're able to take. Pay somebody else to go on their behalf. So maybe some of your ancestors were palmers because it was a very profitable thing to do, and it was an adventure. Some people just love traveling, so that was something they could do. So palmers came back with all sorts of exciting information to sort of continue with Martin's question. They came back with stories of other parts of the world, the Mediterranean, what was going on. They were a very rich source of news. And other people travelled. We call them salesmen today. People did travel to markets. They picked up news from the marketplace. That was local news. And some of them travelled further, and some people went to London and came back full of what was going on in London. But it was very hit and miss, to answer Martin's question. Most of our ancestors lived in a small village community, and they didn't, it was said that when a monarch died, it took 3 weeks for the news to reach the northern dales in Yorkshire.
Wow.
But they weren't particularly worse off for that reason. We've got too much news. We're bombarded with news.
It should be said.
So our ancestors had probably had a much pleasanter time, just being concerned with their very small local area. Their world was very small compared with our world today, when we know what's going on everywhere. And we've got news overkill, really. So I think our ancestors were probably much more content than we are.
Okay. Thank you, Judy. That's a lovely session.
Well, thank you very much indeed for listening. I hope I haven't offended anybody.
Oh,
We are talking about hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
if you want to offend somebody, do it properly. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you very much indeed for listening. And
Now,
stay
can I wish
well.
everybody a happy Easter?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
we shall meet again on the 15th of April. And then we go straight through to the 20th of May. So I will put that out in a note, but just so that you've got advance warning, nothing on All Fool's Day. Thank you, Judy. Thank
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Judy. Thank you, Martin. Happy Easter.